Why was everyone staring at her like she didn't belong? She stood quietly at the far end of the simulation bridge, gray jumpsuit, hair tied in a simple knot, her posture unremarkable. To most of the cadets, she looked like a maintenance tech who'd wandered in by mistake. No insignia, no name tag, no rank. Just ordinary. And that was her first mistake, or so they thought. The air inside Sim X7 was sharp and cold, humming with the faint static of holographic emitters. In the center of that massive chamber stood Cadet Commander Jorich, the golden boy of Aegis Command College. Every step he took carried the confidence of someone who believed destiny had already chosen him. His black and gold uniform was pressed to perfection. Every medal, every stripe gleamed under the sterile white lights. Behind him, his hand-picked Aegis squad stood like a chorus of mirrors, repeating his smirks, echoing his tone, feeding off his ego. To them, Jorich wasn't just a leader. He was what they wanted to become, untouchable. So when they saw her, that woman in the dull gray, standing near the engineering console, quietly scanning a data screen, they laughed. Not the nervous laughter of curiosity, but the brittle, superior laughter of those who have never been challenged. Jorich didn't waste the opportunity. His voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Someone get the custodian out of here before she trips over a conduit and files a report," he sneered. The squad burst into obedient chuckles. She didn't move, didn't even blink. Her eyes stayed on the faint blue glow of the monitor, a ripple of energy fluctuation she was quietly observing. Her hands were steady, her breathing calm. It was as if the insult had drifted past her without consequence, like a soft gust that couldn't move a stone. To Jorich, that silence felt like defiance. To her, it was simply focus. But far above, in the dimly lit observation gallery, a different kind of silence took hold. General Thern Vance, commandant of the academy, leaned forward in his chair. He was an old man built from battles, the kind whose scars had long outlasted the wars that gave them. And in that moment, he wasn't watching the simulation. He was watching her. The stance, the stillness, the balance in her feet, weight distributed perfectly. No tension, no uncertainty. He'd seen that stance once before, decades ago, in a place no one spoke about anymore. A classified war that had left half a fleet in ruins and the other half haunted. His breath caught, slow and deliberate. He knew that posture. He knew what it meant. And a strange mix of dread and respect coiled in his gut. He whispered, almost to himself, "No, it can't be her." But it was. Below, Jorich's arrogance filled the room again. He strutted toward her, pretending not to notice the subtle tension spreading through the technicians on the side stations. Some of them knew she had arrived with the general's entourage. None of them knew why. "Ma'am," Jorich said, his tone dripping with mock respect. "This is a restricted simulation zone, fleet-level operations. We don't need sanitation staff in the command deck." The squad chuckled again. Louder this time. Their laughter bounced off the steel and glass walls, feeding his confidence. For the first time, she looked up. Her eyes, pale blue, sharp as fractured ice, met his for less than a second. No anger. No fear. Just assessment. The kind of look a surgeon gives a broken instrument before setting it aside. Then she looked down again, as if he wasn't worth another second. That tiny gesture, that almost invisible nod, was the crack in Jorich's armor he didn't even feel forming. He mistook her silence for weakness. But silence has gravity, and hers was pulling everything toward it. He barked a laugh. "Unbelievable. The brass sends us a mute janitor as a good luck charm." He turned to his crew. "Let's show the cleaning staff how real officers handle the maelstrom run. Initiate sequence." A junior tech hesitated, glancing toward the observation deck, but General Vance didn't move. He just folded his hands. Watching. The simulation flared to life. Outside the massive forward view screen, the void bloomed into a storm, swirling plasma clouds in violent shades of crimson and violet. The Maelstrom, the Academy's most infamous test. An unwinnable scenario designed to crush arrogance and expose weakness. But Jorich didn't believe in unwinnable. He had studied every file, every debrief, every fragment of data. He had convinced himself that he'd found the flaw, a perfect path through chaos that no one before him had seen. He didn't see a test. He saw a stage. The bridge came alive with energy. Orders snapped like whips across the air. Helm full power to forward thrusters. Tactical, prepare for evasive pattern Delta 9. The cadets moved with theatrical precision, their voices sharp, their movements rehearsed. Everything looked flawless. For the first few minutes it was. Jorich smiled, that tight, self-satisfied grin of a man who'd mistaken control for mastery. Each successful maneuver fed his belief. Each simulated enemy destroyed reinforced the illusion. He even looked at her, the silent woman by the console, and smirked. See that? That's how it's done. But the Maelstrom run wasn't designed to be beaten. It was designed to break belief. And it began with a whisper. A flicker. A soft tone on the engineering display. Then a second. The power grid stuttered. A cascade failure spread like infection. A warning light blinked red, then 3, then 20. Report, Jorich barked, still calm. The engineering cadet stammered, main reactors fluctuating, containment unstable. Before he could finish, a simulated plasma burst ripped across his console. Smoke. Sparks. A flash of red text, incapacitated. The bridge lighting dimmed. Systems died one by one, navigation, sensors, targeting. All gone. The room plunged into red emergency glow, and suddenly the air felt heavy. Too real. Panic spread faster than the failure. Helm control lost. We're blind. I can't get comms. Jorich froze, all the brilliance, all the certainty, gone in an instant. The storm outside swirled like a living thing, alive and merciless. His perfect plan had collapsed into chaos. And she hadn't moved. The woman in gray stood still, eyes tracking the dying systems with that same clinical calm. Then slowly, she set her datapad aside. And moved. No hesitation. No words. Just a steady walk toward the darkened communication station. The cadets parted without knowing why. Something in her presence demanded space. Even Jorich's voice faltered as she passed him. What do you think you're doing? He managed, voice cracking. She didn't answer. Her hand brushed over the dead console, a faint trail of static following her fingers. The seat's former occupant, playing his role as incapacitated, stumbled out of her way. She sat down. The holographic display was dead. Just static. But her hands didn't hesitate. She began typing, not frantic, not panicked, methodical, rhythmic, almost musical. Her fingers moved faster than the others could follow. The code on the screen shifted. Error lines vanished. Subsystems blinked green one after another. She wasn't fixing it. She was rebuilding it. Bypassing protocols, rerouting power from life support to auxiliary channels, trapping corrupted code in feedback isolation. Every motion of her hands was deliberate, perfect. It was like watching someone speak directly to the machine in its own language, a dialect none of them even knew existed. The alarms began to fade. Light steadied. The chaos dimmed into silence. Then a single line of text appeared on the main screen, glowing in crisp green letters. "Com link established. Fleet command uplink secure." Silence. Total absolute silence. The simulation, the unstoppable test, had been stabilized. Not beaten with aggression. Not conquered by command. But tamed by competence. George stood frozen, mouth open, staring at her. The woman who hadn't said a single word since she arrived had just done the impossible. Above them, General Vance rose slowly to his feet. His chest felt heavy, full of memory. He keyed the command line. "Full stop," he said quietly. "Spotlight on the comm station." The nebula froze mid-storm, dissolving into the neutral grid of a paused sim. Then a single white beam fell from the ceiling, illuminating her like the eye of God. She didn't flinch. Didn't even look up. She was running diagnostics, calm, steady, as though the act of saving their lives had been just another line of code to clean. The sound of boots echoed down the metal stairs. Heavy, controlled. General Vance stepped onto the bridge. The cadets snapped to attention, their fear of failure instantly replaced by a deeper one, the presence of command. But Vance didn't look at them. He walked past each one, eyes fixed on her. He stopped behind her chair. Silence pressed down on every heartbeat in the room. Then his voice, low, gravelly, filled the bridge. "Cadets," he began. "For 50 years the Maelstrom run has been the ultimate test of this academy. It is designed to break you, to remind you that arrogance is death, that some battles cannot be won by force, only endured with grace." No one moved. He turned slowly, facing George. "And you, Cadet Commander, failed that test before it even began." George's breath caught. Vance's eyes burned cold. "You saw her," he said, gesturing to the woman still quietly closing her console. "And you saw nothing. You saw a janitor, a civilian, someone beneath you." He paused. "Your arrogance made you blind." He turned fully now, facing the stunned cadets. "Let me correct your blindness." His voice thundered. "This is Fleet Admiral Eva Rostova." The words hit like a detonation. The air left the room. Every cadet froze, eyes wide, mouths open. Her name was legend. Whispered in training halls. The ghost of the Orion Spur. The architect of the impossible victory at Cygni's IX, where 3 ships held off an entire armada using nothing but code and courage. And now she sat before them, wearing gray. Silent. Watching. General Vance straightened, and then, to everyone's astonishment, raised his hand in a sharp salute. The gesture of a warrior acknowledging another. "Admiral Rostova," he said, voice thick with reverence. "On behalf of the Aegis Command College, my deepest apologies for the reception you received. It is an honor." She looked up at him at last. Calm, collected. Her voice, when it finally came, was soft, even. "The chorus sound, General," she said. "The human element still requires calibration." Her eyes slid to George. He didn't need to be told what that meant. He already knew. And in that silence, that single unbroken silence, a boy's pride shattered. And a legend was reborn. Because sometimes, true authority doesn't shout. It doesn't posture. It doesn't announce itself. It simply acts, and lets the universe fall quiet around it. Why did silence feel heavier than any punishment? The simulation chamber was still glowing with the artificial light of the paused grid, but no one dared to move. The woman they had mocked, the one they dismissed as invisible, sat at the communications console, the center of the storm she had single-handedly calmed. The cadets stood frozen, the air thick with disbelief. It wasn't fear anymore. It was something colder, something sharper, the unbearable awareness of what they'd just done. No one spoke. Not even Jorich. His mouth was dry, his chest tight, as if the oxygen itself had turned against him. All the medals, all the hours of training, all the confidence he had built over years, none of it meant anything in that moment. Because he knew what he had become, a fool in front of a legend. General Vance's voice broke the silence like gravel sliding down a steel plate. For 50 years, he said slowly, this academy has tested cadets with simulations. We measure reflexes, decisions, courage. But there is one thing no test can measure until it breaks you. He turned his gaze to the squad, each of them standing ramrod straight, afraid to even breathe. That thing is humility. He let the word hang there. It is what separates an officer from a liability. The silence stretched longer. Jorich wished for anything, a reprimand, a shout, an order. But instead he got something worse. Pity. Vance turned toward Rostova again, his eyes softening just slightly. Then, in a motion that rippled through every cadet's bones, the general, the unbreakable, legendary commandant, stepped aside and saluted her. Sharp, precise. A salute of reverence, not rank. Admiral Rostova, he said, "Ma'am, the floor is yours." She didn't stand, didn't take the spotlight, didn't even lift her gaze from the console she had just restored. Her voice, when it came, was almost too quiet. And yet, every soul on that bridge heard her. "The system works," she said. "The simulation is stable." Then she paused. Her tone shifted, softer now, but each word carried the weight of judgment. The human variable remains unpredictable. Her eyes lifted, meeting Jorich. "You all mistook silence for weakness," she said simply, "and arrogance for command." No one moved. Her words weren't cruel. They were surgical. Command, she continued, is not about who speaks the loudest or who stands tallest. It's about who listens when the noise is gone. She rose slowly from the chair. Her gray jumpsuit caught the sterile light, plain, unassuming, utterly unbecoming of a fleet admiral. But somehow, she seemed larger than the room. She looked once more at Jorich. Her voice was calm, almost kind. "The lesson is yours, cadet. Don't waste it." Then she turned not toward the exit, but toward the engineering console. She signed out of the system herself, fingers moving with quiet efficiency, and walked out through the same side door she had entered from. No security detail. No ceremony. Just silence trailing behind her like gravity. The door hissed shut. And the world felt different. For a long while no one spoke. General Vance finally broke the stillness with a deep exhale. His voice came low, measured, heavy with the weight of years. "Dismissed." The word struck harder than a shout. The cadets filed out stiff, silent, their faces pale and eyes wide. But not Jorich. He stayed. He stood in the center of the bridge, staring at the darkened console where she had sat. The soft reflection of his own face stared back at him from the glass surface. He barely recognized it. Vance approached, slow, deliberate steps echoing in the emptiness. "Cadet Commander," he said quietly. Jorich stiffened. "Sir." "Walk with me." They left the simulator together, the faint hum of power fading behind them as the heavy door sealed shut. The corridor outside was dim, lined with quiet light panels that flickered with a bluish glow. Jorich walked beside the general in silence. His mind was chaos, fragments of shame, disbelief, and confusion clashing inside him like debris in orbit. Finally, Vance stopped beside a viewing window that overlooked the vast training hangar below. Ships, simulators, and cadets moved far beneath them, each one tiny, unaware that something monumental had just shifted above them. Vance didn't look at Jorich as he spoke. "You know who she is now?" Jorich nodded faintly. "Yes, sir." "Do you know what she did?" Jorich swallowed. I've heard stories. Vance's eyes hardened. Stories don't cover it. He turned then, really looking at him. She designed the maelstrom run. The words hit like a punch. Jorich blinked. She what? The simulation you thought you could beat, Vance said. The one you called flawed, she built it. Every algorithm, every failure point, every trap. Jorich's voice faltered. Then this wasn't a coincidence. Vance shook his head slowly. Nothing about her ever is. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant hum of engines from the hangar below. Vance sighed, his gaze drifting away again. She wrote the tactical core used in every capital ship in this fleet. Her strategies saved entire sectors, but what she values most isn't victory. He glanced at Jorich. It's restraint. Jorich felt something tighten in his chest. He wanted to defend himself, to say he hadn't known. But that excuse dissolved before it ever reached his lips. Because ignorance wasn't innocence. It was arrogance wearing a mask. She said I failed before it began, Jorich murmured. Vance nodded once. She was right. There was no anger in his tone, only truth. Your failure wasn't in losing control of the simulation, Vance said softly. It was in losing control of your judgment. He turned back toward the window, his reflection merging with the stars beyond the glass. You saw a uniform and assumed it carried worth. You saw the lack of one and assumed it carried none. That's the sickness she came here to diagnose. Jorich said nothing. Because what could he say? He remembered her fingers moving across the dead console. The way her silence filled the air. The calm precision that made chaos bow. And for the first time in his life, he felt small. Truly, utterly small. Vance placed a hand on his shoulder, heavy, calloused, but not unkind. You'll live with this, he said. And if you're smart, you'll let it shape you. Then he turned and walked away, leaving Jorich alone in the corridor, staring through the glass at the endless field of stars. He stayed there long after the lights dimmed into night cycle. The whispers started the next morning. It began in the mess hall. Then in the flight simulators. Then in the zero-G training modules. A rumor spreading not like gossip, but like gravity. They called it the ghost on the bridge. No one said her name aloud at first. It felt too sacred. They whispered about the janitor who had brought a simulation to its knees, with a few lines of code. Some said she'd rewritten the system with her mind. Others claimed the lights had flickered in time with her heartbeat. The truth didn't matter anymore. The myth had already taken root. By the end of the week, cadets lowered their voices when passing Sim Deck 7. They didn't look directly at the communications console. They avoided it, as if the ghost still lingered there listening. And maybe she did. For Jorich, the humiliation didn't fade. It evolved. His followers, the ones who used to laugh at his jokes, who mirrored his arrogance, started to drift away. No one wanted to be near the fallen golden boy. He'd become a symbol of what not to be. For the first time in his life, silence followed him wherever he went. He stopped talking in the hallways, stopped arguing in class. He'd sit alone at the simulator terminals after hours, replaying the moment over and over again. Her hands on the console, that single green line of code appearing on the screen. He couldn't forget it. He didn't want to. He just wanted to understand it. Weeks passed. The academy went on. New drills, new cadets. But for Jorich, time had slowed to the speed of self-awareness. He was no longer the commander of Aegis Squad. General Vance had quietly stripped him of that title. No formal punishment, no expulsion. Just absence. The kind that eats at you in silence. And yet, somewhere within that emptiness, something new began to form. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't even shame. It was hunger. To learn. To rebuild. To never be that blind again. One night long after curfew, George found himself walking toward the hangar decks, unsure why. The lights were dim, the corridors quiet except for the faint hum of coolant lines. He heard voices, low, steady, focused. And there she was. Eva Rostova. Not in uniform. Not behind a console. But kneeling beside an open plasma conduit, grease on her hands, teaching a group of junior engineers how to diagnose a microfracture in a casing. No spotlight. No audience. Just work. George stopped, watching her from a distance. For the first time, he didn't see a ghost or a legend. He saw a person. A leader who didn't command respect. She created it, quietly, by being the kind of competence that required no introduction. He didn't step forward, not yet. He just stood there in the soft light of the hangar, watching her move, methodical, patient, human. And in that quiet, something inside him shifted. Not all at once, but enough. Because sometimes, growth doesn't come with fire and fury. It comes with stillness. And the sound of a man realizing how little he truly knows. How do you approach the person who dismantled everything you thought you were? George stood there for nearly an hour, hidden in the shadows of the hangar bay, watching her work. It didn't look like the legend of Fleet Command. There was no spotlight, no uniform. Just a gray jumpsuit, streaked with grease, and a woman whose hands moved with quiet certainty across the open conduit of a training vessel. She wasn't commanding. She wasn't lecturing. She was teaching in silence. The young engineers around her hung on every motion, every small gesture. She didn't give orders. She gave presence. When she pointed at a diagnostic reading, they understood. When she raised a brow, they corrected themselves before she spoke. Every movement of hers carried the kind of authority that never needed to be declared. And watching her, George realized how little he had ever truly led. He'd memorized tactics. He'd practiced confidence. He'd learned how to sound like a commander, but not how to be one. And now, stripped of title, stripped of pride, he stood there, a cadet with no identity, staring at the embodiment of everything he'd failed to be. Rostova straightened, wiping a streak of oil from her cheek with the back of her hand. Her hair had come loose from its bun, a few silver strands falling into her face. She looked human, tired even. Not a myth, not a ghost, just real. Something in that realization made his chest tighten. He took a step forward, then another. The engineers noticed him first. Their shoulders tensed, the atmosphere subtly changing. The fallen golden boy had entered their space. Rostova looked up. Her pale eyes found him instantly. Not unkind, not welcoming. Just aware. He froze mid-step, unsure if he should salute, speak, or retreat. Every instinct screamed at him to leave, but he stayed. Because for once, his instincts had led him wrong before. "Admiral," he said quietly. His voice barely carried across the hum of machinery. Rostova didn't respond. She turned back to the conduit, running her scanner across a flickering readout. George waited. The silence stretched between them, not hostile but testing. He realized then, silence was her language. And she was waiting to see if he could learn it. So he waited with her. Minutes passed. Only the hum of the plasma line filled the space. Finally she spoke. Without looking up. "Cadet Commander George." His chest tightened. The way she said his title, past tense, precise, carried more weight than any reprimand. He lowered his eyes. "Ma'am." She replaced a small interface chip with calm precision. Then, without preamble, she said, The energy fluctuations in this manifold. What do you see? George blinked, caught off guard. He looked at the console, at the flickering diagnostic light. Pressure inconsistency, he said cautiously, possibly a failing core segment. She glanced at him just once. Textbook answer, she said softly, and wrong. He flushed. She continued, her tone even. An observant officer would notice the microfractures in the outer casing. The seal is compromised, not the core. She tapped the screen lightly. One fix costs the fleet 1,000,000 credits, the other costs 10. Her gaze lifted. Assumptions make you blind. Out there they get you killed. Here they just make you wasteful. George felt his throat tighten again. He nodded slowly. Yes, ma'am. Rostova turned back to her tools. Hand me that hydrospanner. He blinked, ma'am. The spanner, cadet. He fumbled for it, passed it to her with both hands. She took it without looking at him, adjusted the pressure seal, and with one clean motion, the flickering stabilized. The diagnostic lights turned green. She gave a small nod to the junior engineers. That's how you see, not how you look. The cadets murmured their understanding, quietly dispersing to log the readings. For a moment, only she and George remained. The hum of the ship filled the space between them. He spoke first. Admiral, I owe you an apology. She didn't respond. He swallowed hard. I have no excuse for how I acted on that bridge. My arrogance was a failure of character. I saw what I wanted to see, not what was there. She set her tools down and finally faced him. For the first time, he saw her eyes up close, steady, unblinking, not harsh but impossibly honest. He expected a lecture, maybe even anger. He got neither. She just studied him in silence. And in that silence, George felt smaller than he ever had before. Then she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. A gesture that felt like judgment and forgiveness at once. Then in that same quiet tone, she said, Good, now learn. She turned back to her work, leaving him standing there, not dismissed, but invited to stay. He didn't move for a moment. Then he reached for the secondary console beside her, opening the diagnostic panel she'd left running. For the next hour, they worked side by side. No words. Just the rhythm of tools, the faint click of keys, the shared breath of two people focused on a single task. When she adjusted a valve, he watched her hands. When she recalibrated the conduit, he mirrored the motion. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't trying to lead. He was learning to understand. He realized something profound that night, something no textbook, no simulation, no award had ever taught him. Leadership wasn't about control. It was about comprehension. And comprehension required humility. By the time the maintenance log read task completed, the hangar had gone quiet. The junior engineers had gone. Only the two of them remained. She closed the diagnostic file, removed her gloves, and wiped her hands with a small cloth. Then, without looking at him, she asked, What did you learn, cadet? He hesitated, searching for the right words. That the system doesn't care who gives the order. It only responds to who understands it. Rostova glanced at him then, the faintest ghost of approval flickering in her expression. Closer, she said softly, but not quite. She leaned against the open conduit, her gaze distant, thoughtful. The ship doesn't respond to understanding alone. It responds to respect. You don't command it, you listen to it. She looked at him again. The same applies to people. George lowered his head. Her words hit harder than any reprimand ever could. Respect. It was such a simple word. But in her voice, it felt like scripture. She picked up her datapad, checking the final logs. Then, as she turned to leave, she said, You'll make a good officer one day, Cadet Jorich. He looked up, startled. Her expression didn't change. "If," she added, "you stop trying to be one." Then she walked away, calm, unhurried, disappearing into the dim corridor beyond the hangar doors. Jorich stood there for a long time, watching the space she left behind. He didn't know if she just insulted him or saved him. Maybe both. But one thing was certain: he'd follow that lesson for the rest of his life. The academy began to change in quiet ways after that. It started small. An instructor quoting her words during a debrief. A cadet whispering her name like a prayer before a test. They called it Rostova's standard. And slowly, without order or announcement, it became the unspoken rule across the academy. The loudest voice wasn't the one in charge, the quietest one was. The instructors noticed it first. Cadets were calmer. They asked more questions. They stopped treating the technicians like background noise. Even Jorich, once the loudest, the boldest, the most certain, now spent his days where no one expected to find him. In the lower decks, among the mechanics and system techs, learning. He no longer chased rank. He chased competence. And Rostova. She never said a word about him. Never praised him. Never mentioned that night in the hangar again. But every time she walked past him, she'd give that same quiet nod. The same one she'd given when she broke his arrogance. The same one she'd given when she forgave him. That nod became his medal. A symbol not of victory, but of worth. Because some honors aren't worn. They're carried quietly, invisibly, in the choices you make when no one's watching. And as the months passed, the lesson spread far beyond one cadet's shame. It seeped into the culture of the academy itself, subtle at first, then unstoppable. The myth of the ghost on the bridge evolved into something new. Cadets began saying, "Don't pull a Jorich." It meant don't judge by rank. Don't mistake silence for ignorance. And then another phrase was born. Have a Rostova moment. It meant when everyone else panics, stay calm. When others shout, listen. When all else fails, act quietly, precisely, and with purpose. And so, through whispers, stories, and silence, a culture changed. All because one woman refused to announce her greatness. She simply was. And one young man, broken, humbled, reborn, began to see the world differently. Because sometimes, the hardest lesson isn't how to win. It's how to listen. And silence, when understood, can teach louder than any command ever will. How does an institution built on pride learn to listen? The answer didn't come in an announcement. There was no grand speech, no official policy, no decree from the commandant's office. It started with whispers and silence. The story of Sim Deck 7 spread through the academy not as rumor, but as revelation. No one had to embellish it, the truth was powerful enough. A woman in a plain gray jumpsuit had walked into the heart of a storm and tamed it. Not with force, not with command, but with competence. Every cadet, every instructor, every technician knew the story. It became a mirror, reflecting back their own arrogance, their assumptions, their need to look like officers instead of being them. They whispered her name like a code phrase. Rostova. And though she never sought it, she became a legend within living memory. Cadets began to change. Slowly, subtly, they lowered their voices in the mess hall. They started listening to the technicians during briefings. They asked questions they would have once dismissed as beneath them. For the first time, the academy began to feel less like a theater and more like a workshop, filled not with performers but with learners. And in the middle of it all stood Jorich. He was no longer the academy's golden boy. No longer the star commander with the flawless record and polished confidence. He was just another cadet. But for the first time, that felt right. He had traded applause for understanding. He spent hours in the hangar decks, covered in oil, repairing training drones with the junior techs. He attended engineering briefings that had nothing to do with command, but everything to do with comprehension. He started small, quiet, patient. He didn't lead teams anymore, he supported them. He didn't argue, he asked. He didn't demand, he learned. And slowly, others began to notice. One day, a young communications cadet found herself struggling with a data relay calibration. It was a minor fault, a flicker in the transmission matrix, but one that could have ruined her simulation score. Jorich noticed from across the bay. He walked over calm, careful not to embarrass her. "What do you see?" he asked. She looked up, flustered. "I think it's a power drain from the central node, sir." He shook his head softly. "Assumption." He pointed to the secondary readout. "The waveform is clean, your power's stable. What does that tell you?" Her eyes widened slowly. "The fault's not power, it's timing, a latency error." He nodded once. "Good, now fix it." She did. The line stabilized. When she looked back up, Jorich was already walking away. No speech. No congratulations. Just quiet understanding. She never forgot that. Neither did her team. The academy began to change not through new orders, but through example. Small acts of patience. Small lessons in silence. And though few ever saw her again, Admiral Rostova's influence was everywhere. She'd appear without warning, one moment in the engineering labs, another in the tactical department. Always unannounced, always in gray. Always watching. Her presence was never dramatic. She didn't walk in like a commander. She slipped in like a whisper. And wherever she went, the air seemed to sharpen. She didn't correct loudly. She asked questions that made people stop and think. One instructor recalled her observing a navigation simulation. The cadet at the helm had executed a near-perfect run. Rostova had said nothing until the end. Then, as the cadet celebrated his score, she asked softly, "Tell me, what was your navigator doing during the final approach?" The cadet froze. They were monitoring sensors. "No," she said gently. "They were waiting for your permission to act." She leaned forward slightly. "You didn't lose the simulation, cadet. You lost a crewmate's confidence. That's harder to rebuild." No one forgot her words. Because they weren't instructions. They were reflections. Every encounter with her left ripples, invisible but permanent. General Vance saw it happening, and for the first time in decades, he allowed himself to feel hope. He'd spent half his career trying to teach humility through lectures, drills, and punishments. None of it had worked. And then one woman had done what he never could. Not by preaching humility, but by embodying it. He ordered Sim Deck 7 to remain untouched. The configuration, the lighting, even the final message on the console screen. Com link established, Fleet Command uplink secure. He had that image framed in the instructor's lounge, a quiet reminder of the day arrogance met its reckoning. They started calling it Rostova's Bridge, a sacred space where competence was born and ego came to die. Cadets didn't joke there. They didn't posture. They entered quietly, as if the room itself remembered what had happened. Even years later, the faint impression of that day lingered in the air. Some said if you listened closely, you could still hear the hum of that impossible silence, the one that came right after she fixed the unfixable. Jorich visited often, not to relive his failure, but to remember his beginning. He'd stand in front of the same console, hands clasped behind his back, watching the blank screen. And every time he'd feel it again, that strange mixture of shame and gratitude. He began keeping a small journal, not of victories, not of drills, but of lessons, questions she taught him to ask. What do I not see? What assumptions cloud my judgment? Who around me knows more than I do, and have I asked them? It became his ritual, his quiet discipline, and without realizing it, he began to teach others the same way she had taught him. Not with lectures, with silence. He didn't tell cadets what to think. He asked them what they'd missed. He didn't correct them. He guided them to correct themselves. It was slower, harder, but it stuck. Weeks turned into months. Jorich's reputation, once destroyed, began to rebuild not as the Academy's prodigy, but as its standard. He wasn't admired for his skill anymore. He was respected for his composure. Instructors noticed. So did General Vance. One evening, the old general found him sitting alone in the training bay, reviewing maintenance schematics. Vance watched for a moment before speaking. "You've been quiet lately." Jorich smiled faintly. "I've been learning, sir." Vance grunted, sitting beside him on the bench. "That woman, she broke something in you." Jorich nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." Vance's eyes narrowed. "Good, keep it broken." Jorich looked up, confused. Vance chuckled softly. "Arrogance, cadet, is like armor. Once it cracks, most people try to patch it back up. The wise ones leave it open." He rose, his old boots creaking. "That's how light gets in." Then he left, leaving Jorich with those words, another quiet echo in a growing collection of lessons carved by humility. Graduation season arrived. The assembly hall shimmered with ceremony, banners, brass, and a sea of proud uniforms. Families filled the balconies, watching as the next generation of officers stood in formation. Jorich was among them. No longer at the front row. No medals. No spotlight. And he was fine with that. When General Vance took the podium, the hall fell silent. His voice was older now, steadier, gentler, but still carrying the authority of someone who'd seen too much and learned enough. "The fleet needs more than brilliance," he said. "It needs wisdom. It needs those who can command storms without becoming one." He paused. "Today, we honor not just achievement, but transformation." Then he said the words no one expected. "This year's recipient of the Horatius Prize for Leadership and Humility is Cadet Jorich." A wave of murmurs swept the room, disbelief, then respect. Jorich's breath caught. He didn't move at first. Then he did, not with pride, but with purpose. He walked the long aisle to the stage, every step echoing softly in the vast hall. When he reached the podium, Vance handed him the small silver insignia, a symbol of humility and command united. Jorich didn't give a speech. He just looked out across the sea of faces, cadets, instructors, and somewhere he hoped her. He found no sign of Admiral Ristova. He hadn't expected to. He simply said, "Thank you. I will strive to be worthy of the lesson I was given." Then he stepped back. The applause came slow at first, then steady, sincere, not for achievement but for change. As he left the stage, he looked once more toward the empty balcony at the back of the hall. And for just a moment, he imagined her there. Arms folded, expression unreadable, eyes proud, and maybe, just maybe, a quiet nod. Outside, as the cadets gathered for photographs and celebration, the evening light glowed amber through the academy spires. Somewhere in the distance, the faint hum of a transport shuttle faded into the horizon. Eva Ristova was gone again. No announcement. No farewell. Just as she had arrived, quietly, purposefully, like a ghost passing through circuits, leaving systems stronger than before. And though her ship's name would never appear in official records, Every officer who graduated that year carried something of her in them. They called it the Ristova effect, an understanding that leadership wasn't a sound. It was a silence filled with intent, a silence that could steady hands, open minds, and rebuild an entire generation's soul. Because in the end, some lessons aren't taught by those who speak the loudest. They're taught by those who never need to raise their voice at all. And sometimes, the quietest person in the room is the one who commands it completely. What happens when the storm isn't simulated anymore? Years had passed since the day a gray-suited woman changed the soul of an academy. Time had softened the legend, but not its truth. Every new generation of cadets still whispered her name before their first test, like a quiet invocation. Ristova, a word that meant calm amid chaos. For Joric, it was no longer a whisper. It was a compass. He wore his fleet uniform now, crisp white under the navy blue officer's coat, the insignia of a ship captain on his collar. But even after all these years, he still carried a small grease stain on the cuff of his right sleeve, a silent token of where he began. He never had it cleaned. His ship, the TNS Resolute, was a mid-range exploration vessel. Not a dreadnought, not a warship, just a ship meant to explore and understand. He liked that. It suited him. The crew respected him, though few feared him. He spoke softly, asked questions instead of barking orders, and always ended debriefs with the same line. Listen before you decide. Some thought it made him cautious. Others realized it made him precise. Under his command, the Resolute earned a quiet reputation. No lost lives, no unnecessary risks, no failed missions. Just results delivered without fanfare. And yet, even the calmest seas have their storms. It came without warning. A mission to chart a newly formed plasma nebula near the Veral Expanse, routine, simple, harmless. Until it was. At first, it was just static. A faint interference on the long-range comms. Then a pulse. Then nothing. Every display flickered, sensors scrambled, navigation went dark. Within seconds, the ship that had been gliding through open space was caught in an invisible current. The hull shuddered. Gravity stuttered. The lights dimmed into the familiar, hellish red of emergency power. For a heartbeat, Joric felt time stop. It was the same color. The same sound. The same chaos as that day, years ago in the simulator. Only this time, there was no reset button. Report, he barked, instinct returning. The bridge filled with overlapping voices. Power grid fluctuating. Main sensors offline. Gravitational shear increasing by 30%. He gripped the command rail, his knuckles whitening. Stabilize the grid manually, override auto-compensation. His helmsman, Ensign Kale, struggled to keep her voice steady. Sir, the flux is too strong. We're losing control of the trajectory. Joric looked up at the main screen, the nebula outside boiling with violent color, currents twisting like serpents of fire. Every instinct screamed at him to fight it. To bark orders. To take control. But then a whisper. Not a sound. A memory. The ship doesn't respond to understanding alone, Ristova had said. It responds to respect. He exhaled slowly. Helm, he said quietly. Stop fighting it. Kale blinked, sir. Don't resist the current, map it, watch it, listen to it. The crew hesitated, exchanging uncertain looks. Joric stepped closer to the helm console, placing a steady hand on Kale's shoulder. What do you see? She looked at the sensors, voice trembling. The gravitational shear, it's not random, it's patterned. Exactly. Now align our trajectory with that pattern. Don't push against it, follow it. She adjusted the controls, delicate, careful. The ship lurched once, then again, then steadied. The readings began to stabilize. Jorich turned toward engineering. Divert auxiliary power from the lateral shields to the field dampeners. Keep it balanced like breathing. The engineering officer nodded, moving fast. Within seconds, the trembling beneath their feet softened. The storm outside still roared, but inside something shifted. Order was returning. The crew looked to their captain, waiting for him to break the silence. But he didn't. He stood in the middle of the bridge, calm, focused, quiet. His voice dropped low. "Helm, what's the vector?" "Stable at 187 Mark II. We're drifting clear of the core." "Good, let it guide us out." Minutes stretched like hours. Each breath felt counted. And then the shaking stopped. Outside, the violent plasma field dimmed into calm light, ribbons of color folding gently back into the void. They'd cleared the storm. The bridge was silent again, not in fear but awe. The young communications officer, Ensign Malin, turned from her console. "Captain, how did you know it would work?" Jorich looked at her, then at the vast quiet beyond the screen. "I didn't," he said softly. "I just stopped trying to be right long enough to listen." A soft, collective breath passed through the crew. Somewhere deep in the hum of the engines, a new sound joined relief. Jorich turned toward the main viewport, hands clasped behind his back. He whispered the words he'd once heard years ago. "The human element still requires calibration." And for the first time, he smiled. That night, the Resolute drifted in safe orbit around the nebula's edge. The logs recorded the event as a spontaneous plasma anomaly. But for those who lived it, it was something else. A test. And for Jorich, a hauntingly familiar one. He found himself alone in his quarters, staring at the faint reflection of the nebula's glow through the viewport. He pulled a small data crystal from his pocket, one he'd carried for years, though few knew of it. It contained a fragment of the old SIM Deck 7 recording. He slotted it into the terminal. The screen flickered. And there she was, Admiral Eva Rostova, sitting at the console, hands moving across dead systems. Calm, focused, silent. Jorich leaned back, letting the sound of the old simulation fill the room, the alarms, the chaos, her quiet victory. He remembered the exact moment she looked up at him. That calm, dissecting stare that stripped him of all illusion. He whispered, almost to himself, "I understand now." He paused the playback on the moment she pressed the final key, when the screen showed the simple green text. "Com link established." That phrase had become more than code. It was connection. The moment she reconnected a system, a crew, a soul all at once. He sat there for a long time, the soft hum of the ship his only companion. The following morning, he gathered his officers in the ready room. No formality, no rank display. He looked at each of them, young, talented, eager. They'd proven themselves in crisis. But he wanted more for them. Something she would have wanted. He placed his hands on the table. "Yesterday," he began, "we didn't survive because of me. We survived because of how you listened to each other, how you respected the ship, how you adapted." They watched him silent. He continued, "There's a lesson I learned a long time ago from someone far wiser than me. She said, 'Assumptions make you blind. Listening keeps you alive.'" He paused. "I want that engraved in your habits, not your memory. It's who we are now." He straightened, his voice deepening. "From this day on, the Resolute will operate under one rule, the Rostova rule." The crew exchanged curious looks. "Sir," Kale asked. Jorich smiled faintly. "It means this. When chaos strikes, when nothing makes sense, and when every instinct screams to act, you stop. You breathe. You listen. and then you act with intention. He looked around the room. That's our command code now. Not fear, not ego, just competence. For a moment, no one spoke. Then slowly, one by one, the officers nodded. And something subtle changed in that room. A sense of calm. A sense of alignment. The Rostova rule was born. Months passed. The Resolute became known across the sector for something rare, not its firepower, but its discipline under pressure. Other captains noticed. Other ships adopted the same quiet ethos. Word spread about a crew that worked like a single heartbeat, never shouting, never panicking, never breaking. Some said it was training. Others said it was something deeper. Jorich knew the truth. It was legacy. Her legacy. On the anniversary of his graduation, a small encrypted transmission reached his ship. No sender. No signature. Just a single message. It read, "The core is sound, Captain. Keep calibrating the human element." He read it twice. 3 times. Then he smiled, that quiet, knowing smile of a man who no longer needed recognition to feel seen. He deleted the message without replying. Because some acknowledgments aren't meant to be answered. They're meant to be carried. That night he stood again at the viewport, watching the stars drift by. He thought of her, of the way she'd stood at the console, of the silence that followed her wherever she went. He whispered softly into the void, "Thank you, Admiral." Then, after a long pause, "I hope I'm doing it right." The stars didn't answer. They didn't need to. Because somewhere, light years away, maybe in another quiet hangar, maybe on another ship, a gray-suited woman was looking up at the same stars. And perhaps, just perhaps, she gave a small, invisible nod. Because the greatest leaders don't leave orders behind. They leave echoes. And when those echoes meet silence, they become legacy. Why do lessons echo louder through time than the voices that taught them? The Rostova rule had begun as a phrase whispered aboard one ship. Now it moved through the fleet like an invisible current, carried from bridge to bridge, from cadet to captain. Some called it superstition. Others called it discipline. But everyone who had ever faced the silent weight of command knew it for what it was, truth. Years passed, and Captain Jorich became a name others mentioned with respect that bordered on reverence. Not for heroics, there were no headlines about the Resolute. There were no parades. Only stories told quietly of missions completed without loss, of chaos met with calm, of a captain who never shouted yet was always obeyed. He had grown older. Lines cut across his face like the markings of an old star map, each one pointing to a lesson learned the hard way. The arrogance was gone, the certainty replaced by patience. He carried himself like a man who had finally made peace with the silence between orders. The Fleet Command Academy, once the cradle of ego and performance, was now a different place. The cadets didn't compete to be the loudest voice in the room anymore. They competed to listen best. They still told the story of Sim Deck 7. Every year, before the first major simulation, the instructors played the same clip. A dimly lit bridge, a gray-suited woman moving with the calm of inevitability, and that one line of green text blinking to life. Calm link established. They didn't explain it. They just let the cadets feel it. The lesson was never in the words. It was in the silence that followed. But for Jorich, the legacy wasn't about ceremonies or recordings. It was about what came next. Because history doesn't rest, it repeats. And every generation must face its own storm. The distress call came from the outer colonies. Short-range, garbled, fragmented. A mining convoy had been caught in a rogue plasma current near the Lyrian Drift, a region notorious for electromagnetic storms that ate ships alive. It was far from fleet space, beyond the reach of reinforcements. The Resolute was closest. "Patch the signal through," Jorich ordered. Static filled the bridge. Then a broken voice. "Containment breached, reactor overload, please anyone." Then silence. The coordinates flickered on the nav screen. 3 civilian vessels, drifting dangerously close to the drift's unstable core. The plasma currents there didn't just destroy ships, they erased them. Commander Kale, older now, seasoned, stood beside him. "Sir, the drift's expanding. Entering that field means risk," George finished quietly. He looked out the viewport at the storm ahead, swirling colors of blue and violet, lightning crawling through the void like living veins. He turned to his crew. "Plot an approach vector, minimal emissions, passive sensors only." They obeyed, calm but tense. Every one of them had learned by now that his quiet tone meant the situation was grave. The Resolute entered the drift like a whisper. The hull trembled. Alarms flickered and died. The electromagnetic interference was too strong. For a few minutes, it was all instinct and trust. The ship's sensors painted ghosts on the screens. Energy surges looked like ships. Ships looked like shadows. Then through the static, a faint echo on the comms. "Please anyone, reactor critical." "Lock that signal," Kale said. "Vector 14 Mark 9, reported the navigator. They were close. Too close. As they neared the convoy, 3 shapes emerged from the fog of plasma. Burned, broken, one spinning out of control. Engineering vessel Maris, Kale read from the partial ID. They've lost main power and containment is unstable. Jorich's mind flashed back. Another bridge, another storm, another young commander thinking he could beat the unwinnable. He exhaled slowly. "Helm, match velocity with the Maris. Keep us within tractor range. Engineering, prepare to extend magnetic stabilizers." The crew moved fast, trained hands executing the quiet choreography of competence. But the readings grew worse by the second. "Containment breach in 60 seconds. Jorich's voice stayed calm. "Can we remote seal the core?" "Negative, sir. The interference is too strong." He nodded once. "Then we go manual." The bridge went silent. Kale turned to him. "Sir, you heard me. You can't mean—" "I do, prep the shuttle." She stepped forward. "Captain, that's suicide." He gave her a small, knowing look. "Only if I stop listening." He didn't need to explain further. Within minutes, the shuttle bay doors opened, and Jorich stepped inside the small craft, its hull trembling as energy arcs crawled along its exterior. He moved with deliberate calm, sealing his suit, the plasma light painting his face through the visor. "Flight control, maintain tractor lock, keep the Maris steady." Kale's voice crackled through the comms. "Sir, you shouldn't be the one doing this." Jorich smiled faintly. "That's what they said to someone else once." The shuttle launched, swallowed by the storm. Inside the Maris, everything was chaos. Sparks cascaded from ruptured panels, conduits screamed with pressure. The air shimmered with heat and fear. 3 survivors, engineers terrified, burned, huddled near the auxiliary bulkhead. They flinched when he entered, expecting an explosion. He moved through the wreckage like he'd been there 100 times before. Calm, precise. He reached the core chamber, its containment field flickering violently. Warning lights pulsed red across the floor. He remembered her voice. "The system doesn't care who gives the order. It only responds to who understands it." He knelt by the terminal, hands steady despite the tremors. The code was old, fractured. Reactor models like this had been decommissioned decades ago. But the architecture, he knew it. It was her design. Restova's design. He smiled faintly, even as sweat dripped into his eyes. Of course it was. He began typing. Not fast. Not frantic. Just deliberate, like a prayer typed in code. The readings shifted. Containment stabilized. Power rerouted to emergency vents. The system's whine softened. The heat dropped. The tremors eased. And then silence. He leaned back, exhaling a single shaky breath. The screen glowed green. Reactor containment restored. He whispered, forward/forward, link established. The words felt sacred now. Behind him, one of the engineers stared at him, wide-eyed. How did you do that? Jorich smiled faintly. I just listened. By the time he returned to the Resolute, the storm was breaking apart. 3 ships saved. 0 casualties. As the docking clamps sealed and the airlock hissed open, Kale was waiting. She didn't salute. She just stared at him, eyes wet with relief and frustration. You could have died. He shrugged gently. Would have been a fair trade. She saved me first. She frowned, confused. He didn't explain. He just walked past her back to the bridge, his steps steady and slow. On the main screen, the storm faded into quiet light. It looked peaceful now, like a scar that had finally stopped hurting. Weeks later at Fleet Command headquarters, Jorich was summoned for debrief. The room was sterile, full of brass and formality. They asked him 100 questions. He answered simply, honestly, humbly. One admiral, an older man with thin hair and a colder heart, leaned forward. You disobeyed standing protocol. You risked a captain's life for a civilian crew. Jorich looked at him, unflinching. Yes, sir. The man narrowed his eyes, and if it had failed? Jorich smiled faintly. Then it would have been my failure to own. A long pause. The board exchanged glances. Finally, another officer, a woman with silver hair and a familiar stillness, spoke quietly. Perhaps that's what command is, gentlemen, ownership. Her tone froze the room. Jorich turned his head. Something about her voice, her posture, the way she folded her hands on the table. But when he looked closer, she wasn't there anymore. Just an empty chair. He blinked. Maybe fatigue. Maybe memory. Maybe something else. Later that night, he sat alone in his quarters, the stars drifting slowly past the window. He opened his journal, the same one he'd started years ago after the academy. He wrote the words carefully, deliberately. The Restova rule holds. Silence saves more lives than sound. Listening is command. He paused, then wrote one more line. Legacy isn't a story we tell. It's the space we leave for others to fill. He closed the journal and set it beside his chair. Outside, the nebula shimmered faintly in the distance. He whispered into the quiet. I kept calibrating, Admiral. And somewhere, across the cold infinity of stars, perhaps a faint, knowing nod answered him back. Because time moves forward. But the best lessons don't. They stay, waiting for the next storm, the next captain, the next arrogant cadet who thinks silence means weakness. And when that day comes, the echo will return. A voice calm and certain, whispering through the static of chaos. Listen before you decide. Because leadership isn't noise. It's stillness given shape. And in the dark between the stars, stillness can save entire worlds. How far can one woman's silence carry? Decades passed. The Resolute was decommissioned long ago, its hull now resting in the orbital museum above Terra Nova, a silent monument to a generation that learned humility the hard way. But its story didn't end there. Because legacies don't live in ships. They live in people. Captain Jorich's name became a lesson at the academy, not for heroics, but for restraint. And behind that name, buried in records and whispers, was another, the one they all still spoke with reverence and uncertainty. Ristova. For new cadets she was legend. A ghost from the archives. A story told before the first field drill, always beginning with the same words. She was the one who walked in wearing gray. But for Commander Lyra Hale, that story was more than myth. It was a compass she had built her life around. Lyra was young, too young by most standards, to be commanding a vessel of her own. But her composure set her apart. Calm, analytical. Her instructors used to joke that she had the emotional temperature of deep space, steady, cold, unshakable. They were wrong. She wasn't cold. She was controlled. She had learned it from the old recordings, hours of archived fleet footage, including a grainy clip labeled Sim Deck 7, year 2214. She'd watched it countless times, the same way a pianist might study a single song until every note became instinct. She never told anyone, but she had memorized every sound, every pause, every breath Ristova took. And every time she faced chaos in her training, she heard that same soft, commanding silence in her head. Listen before you decide. Now she stood on the bridge of the TNS Meridian, her first command. It was sleek, modern, faster than the Resolute ever was. But the quiet between orders felt the same. And in that quiet, history waited. The mission was simple: survey a new outpost near the Kestrel Belt, a volatile region of magnetic storms. Nothing out of the ordinary. Until a fragment of an old distress signal caught their sensors. It was faint, broken, but the signature was unmistakable, an ancient fleet ID from the early 2200s. Jorich's era. Lyra frowned, standing over the console. Verify origin. The communications officer hesitated. It's authentic, ma'am. Timestamp places it nearly 40 years old. She studied the data, heartbeat quickening. The signal repeated just 2 words. Core unstable. Her pulse thudded in her ears. Those were the same words from Ristova's training simulation. Coincidence? Maybe. But something deep inside her, a quiet intuition, almost spiritual, whispered otherwise. She took a slow breath. Helm set a course. We're going to find the source. The Meridian entered the Kestrel Belt under silent running. The stars here flickered like dying embers. Radiation storms flared and vanished like breaths. Lyra watched the storm fields ahead, the same swirling plasma she'd only ever seen in hollow recordings of the Veral expanse. The navigator swallowed nervously. Ma'am, proximity interference is spiking. We'll lose external sensors within a minute. Then we listen with what's left, Lyra replied calmly. She walked to the front of the bridge, hand resting lightly on the console railing. She didn't pace. She didn't shout. She just waited. And in that stillness, the crew found their rhythm. The ship's hum softened. The chaos outside became background. Inside, only breath and quiet competence remained. Ma'am, we've got something, said the science officer. Source. 70 kilometers ahead, derelict structure, reading residual reactor emissions. Lyra's voice dropped to a whisper. Put it on screen. The view shifted, and there it was. A shape half swallowed by plasma and time. A wreck. Her first officer frowned. That's impossible. That ship's registry was retired decades ago. Lyra's chest tightened. The nameplate was barely visible through the debris, but when the light struck it, the letters gleamed faintly. TNS Resolute. The bridge fell silent. Even the hum of the engine seemed to fade. Lyra stepped closer, her reflection ghosting over the screen, one commander meeting the shadow of another. She spoke softly, almost reverently. Send a probe, full scan. I want to know if anything is still inside. The probe launched, cutting through the debris field like a comet. Data streamed across the monitors, weak power signatures, ancient airlocks, fractured decks. And then something. A small compartment sealed deep within the ship. The sensors flickered, then returned a faint signal. A single operational beacon, still transmitting on a decades-old frequency. Commander Kale's old emergency channel. Lyra felt her throat tighten. Patch it through. A burst of static filled the air. Then a single repeating message. Comm link established. Fleet command uplink secure. The words hit her like a pulse through her chest. She whispered them under her breath. /forward, link established. Her officers exchanged uncertain glances. To them, it was just a relic's automated loop. But to her, it was a voice from another lifetime. Prepare a boarding team, Lyra ordered. Her first officer hesitated. Ma'am, radiation levels. Minimal, we go in suits. This is history calling, we're answering. Minutes later, the Meridian's shuttle touched down on the silent hull of the Resolute. The ship loomed in the stormlight, scarred and beautiful, its insignia faded but proud. As they entered the airlock, their helmet lamps illuminated dust motes suspended in zero gravity, frozen decades of silence. Lyra's boots touched the deck first. The sound was soft, hollow like stepping into a cathedral. They moved carefully through the corridors. Old fleet banners hung in tatters. Consoles long dead. And on one wall, half-charred but still legible, was a quote etched in brass. The human element, requires calibration. Her breath caught. She reached out, tracing the words with gloved fingers. Ristova's words. She whispered softly. She was here. The first officer turned. Ma'am. Lyra didn't answer. She just kept walking deeper, quieter, as though following a voice only she could hear. They reached the sealed compartment. Manual controls only. Lyra's hands moved across the old mechanisms like she'd done it 1,000 times before. With a hiss, the door slid open. Inside was no tomb. No decay. Just a single console, powered by a tiny autonomous reactor that had somehow survived the decades. Its screen still blinked faint green text. Data node, Arostovie log 2219. Her breath hitched. Download it, she whispered. The console beeped softly, transferring the file to her wrist terminal. A small hologram flickered to life above the screen. And there she was. Admiral Eva Ristova. Older, grayer, but unmistakably her. She looked straight into the lens, her eyes calm, her voice steady, timeless. If you're watching this, Ristova began, then the fleet still stands. That means the lesson survived. Lyra froze. Her hands trembled. Ristova continued. I'm recording this on the last operational day of the Resolute. Captain Jorich has done what every commander must. He's turned silence into strength. The rest is up to those who listen. The hologram flickered, static cutting in and out. Ristova leaned closer, voice softer now. If you ever find this ship, remember humility isn't weakness. It's command without the noise. And legacy isn't written in history books. It's written in choices no one will ever see. The image froze, then faded. Lyra stood motionless, her visor fogging with breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Her first officer whispered, "Who was she?" Lyra smiled faintly, eyes glistening. She was the one who taught the fleet how to listen. Back on the Meridian, the data logs were secured. But Lyra didn't report the find to command right away. She needed time to understand it, to feel it. She sat alone in her quarters, playing the hologram again and again. Each word felt like a pulse from the past, resonating through her like music only she could hear. Finally, she opened her personal log. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke. Admiral Rostova, if somehow this reaches you, know that your silence still leads us. The Rostova rule still holds, and the fleet, your fleet, remembers. She paused, looking out the viewport as the Meridian moved past the debris of the Resolute. A faint smile crossed her lips. You calibrated the human element, Admiral, perfectly. The following morning, she gathered her crew. They stood together on the bridge as the storm outside began to part, revealing a clear stretch of starlit sky. Lyra looked at them, young, uncertain, brave. She spoke softly. Out there, she said, gesturing toward the stars, are the echoes of every voice that taught us to be still. We listen not because we're afraid. We listen because it's the only way to understand. She paused. That's our command code now. The Rostova rule carried forward, again. The crew nodded silent. One by one, consoles flickered alive, systems realigning. And as the Meridian turned back toward open space, a soft reflection of the old Resolute shimmered in the nebula behind them, as if two ships, decades apart, were sailing together one last time. Because silence never truly fades. It just waits for someone new to hear it. How do you measure the weight of silence? Is it in the moments before a choice, or in what follows after? The Meridian left the Kestrel belt behind, carrying more than data. It carried a voice, a lesson, a ghost-turned compass. Commander Lyra Hale had found proof that the legends were real. But she didn't feel pride. She felt responsibility. Because now the question wasn't whether Admiral Rostova existed. It was whether her rule still did. It started as a whisper. An encoded burst through fleet channels, urgent, fragmented, repeating. Outpost Sigma 9 compromised, unknown vessels inbound, civilians trapped. Lyra stared at the message, her reflection shimmering in the screen. Her hands curled into fists. Sigma 9 was a civilian colony. Barely defended. They were miners, families, children. She turned to her crew. How far? 3 hours at maximum warp. Then we go. No hesitation. No speeches. Just quiet motion. The Meridian leapt into the dark. When they arrived, the sight hit them like a punch. The colony was burning, its defensive satellites reduced to drifting slag. 3 assault ships hovered nearby, sleek and angular, painted in the dull gray of an unregistered fleet. Pirates, mercenaries, doesn't matter. Lyra's jaw tightened. Shields up, power weapons. The crew moved fast, trained, ready. But Lyra didn't give the attack order. Not yet. She watched the pattern of the enemy ships, how they moved, how they circled. They weren't random. They were searching for something. Open a wideband hail. Static hissed. Then a cold voice answered. Unknown vessel withdraw. This isn't your concern. Lyra's tone didn't waver. You're attacking a civilian colony. That makes it my concern. Leave, the voice snapped, or you'll share their fate. The channel cut. Her tactical officer looked at her. Orders, ma'am. Lyra didn't speak right away. She walked toward the main viewport, the flames of Sigma 9 flickering across her face. And then quietly, deliberately, she said, Stand down. The crew froze. Kale, her first officer, frowned. Ma'am, what? Power down weapons, she said again, softer. Disengage targeting systems. But, her voice cut through the air like a calm blade. Do it. The bridge went still. One by one, the weapon indicators faded from red to green. The Meridian drifted, shields humming softly, appearing defenseless. On the tactical display, The pirate ships repositioned, confused. Lyra watched the formation carefully. They hesitated, and in that hesitation she saw it. A gap, a flaw in the orbit. They weren't expecting diplomacy, they were expecting defiance. She whispered, "Now we listen." She ordered the communications officer to reopen the channel. This time her tone carried no threat, only conviction. "This is Commander Lyra Hale of the Terran Fleet. You don't need to do this. You're here for something, tell me what it is." Silence. Then a different voice, rough, uncertain. "You wouldn't understand. Try me." A pause. Then static, then a sigh. "The colony stole from us. Tech shipments, supplies, we just want what's ours." Lyra glanced to her data officer. "Verify." A few seconds later, the officer nodded. There was a supply dispute logged 6 months ago, never resolved. She looked back at the comm feed. "Then we can resolve it. No blood, no fire, I'll mediate." The voice sounded almost tired. "Why should we trust you?" She thought for a moment, then said the only thing that mattered. "Because I'm listening." There was another long pause. Then the channel closed. Her crew waited. Weapons still cold. Tension thick as vacuum. Minutes passed. Then sensors beeped softly. The pirate ships began to move. Not toward the colony. Away. They broke formation and warped out, leaving Sigma-9 scarred, but alive. No battle. No bloodshed. No glory. Just peace. And silence. The bridge exhaled collectively. No cheers. No applause. Just that strange, sacred quiet, the kind that follows understanding. Her first officer whispered, "How did you know they'd stand down?" Lyra's eyes stayed on the viewport, watching the dying fires of the colony. "I didn't," she said softly. "I just stopped trying to win." He frowned. "So what did you do?" She smiled faintly. "I listened." Hours later, after the rescue teams confirmed the colony's survival, Lyra stood alone in the observation deck. The stars were quiet again. The chaos behind her was now memory. She took the small data crystal, the one that held Rostova's final message, and turned it over in her hands. Her reflection looked older now, wiser, touched by the same kind of calm that Rostova had worn like armor. She whispered to herself, "This is what you meant, isn't it?" A voice, hers but not hers, answered in her memory. "Humility isn't surrender, it's control shaped by empathy." She closed her eyes. And for the first time, she truly understood what Rostova had built, not a rule. A culture. A quiet rebellion against ego. Fleet Command sent a commendation weeks later. They called it a victory through restraint. But Lyra didn't frame the medal. She placed it in the archives, beside the recovered Resolute beacon and Rostova's message log. She wrote a short note to accompany it. Leadership isn't the art of command. It's the grace to hold silence until truth speaks. CDR Lyra Hale. Years passed again. The fleet grew. New faces filled the bridges. New cadets memorized new names. But in the deep levels of the academy, on Sim Deck 7, a small bronze plaque hung beside the old console that once belonged to Admiral Rostova. It read, "The human element still, REQIRES calibration." The rule still holds. Cadets would walk past it without speaking, unaware of the full story. But they felt it. That gravity. That stillness. And sometimes, in the middle of training chaos, an instructor would call out, "Stop, breathe, listen." And everyone knew. The Rostova rule was alive again. Commander Lyra Hale would go on to train dozens of officers. She never spoke of the Resolute or the Sigma 9 incident. She didn't need to. Instead, she taught the way her heroes had. Through questions, through patience, through silence. When she retired years later, she left behind one final log entry in her personal archive. A message for whoever came after. Her voice was calm, reflective, almost tender. If you find this, I hope you're not looking for orders. I hope you're looking for understanding. The Rostova rule isn't about stillness for its own sake. It's about clarity, about making space for others to be heard. When you lead, do it gently. And if you ever face chaos that feels too big, too loud, don't shout back. Listen. Someone before you already left the answer waiting in the silence. She paused, a soft smile in her tone. The fleet doesn't need louder voices, it needs truer ones. Remember, dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. That final sentence would echo across generations. Fleet manuals would quote it. Cadets would repeat it. And somewhere in the quiet heart of deep space, it would drift. A whisper passing from one soul to another. Dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. In the black between the stars, where time has no weight, a faint signal still transmits. The same one that began everything. Comm link established, fleet command uplink secure. And perhaps far away in the stillness between heartbeats, a voice answers. Soft, eternal, proud. The link was never lost. End of story, final moral reflection. Sometimes the greatest strength isn't found in command, but in calm. Sometimes the most powerful voice is the one that chooses silence. Because leadership isn't about who speaks the loudest. It's about who listens longest. And when the storms fade, when pride collapses, when chaos demands a scream, the ones who remember to breathe, listen, and act with dignity are the ones who truly lead. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts.